there's such an American mentality of how we're going to use all kinds of tools to do things quickly. But I agree with you. There's nothing quick about the Great Commission. It takes time, takes commitment, it takes lifetimes of work, and there's no way you can just do this by clicking a mouse. It just doesn't work that way.
We're doing a class right now at Course called Global Missions in the 21st Century, and as a part of the key course content for this class, we're doing interviews with leaders from around the world, and we are excited to release these to you and invite you to pull up a chair and listen in to these enriching discussions. I'm joined here today by Dr. Timothy Tennent. He's the Methodist Chair of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School there at Sanford in Birmingham. Formerly, you were the president, professor of world Christianity at Asbury Theological Seminary, and before that, you were at Gordon Conwell, and you've done a lot of work overseas. We'll get into that a little bit more, but thanks so much for joining me today and speaking to me and to our students. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here and good to be able to talk to your students.
So, Dr. Tennent, many of our students will know you now because they've been churning through your book, An Invitation to World Missions. They'll know that you're a former seminary president. They'll know a little bit about you, but your story begins obviously long before that. So could you share with us just some key moments in your journey, perhaps your call to ministry, to missions, and eventually how you got into this work of missiology?
Thanks, Hoffman. Yes, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up in a very confined Orthodox Jewish community of Atlanta. And so we were the only Gentiles in this whole, big area. So all my neighbors, friends, schoolmates, et cetera, in my school were all Jews. And so I think that probably, looking back on it, I think that's probably what helped me to think about what it's like to grow up as a religious other, be a kind of a different person. And so I think it gave me an interest in the world and things like that from an early age. But I when I was in high school, I had a very dramatic conversion to Christ and call into ministry. I really thought I would be of course, a pastor is a wonderful calling. I thought I would be a pastor. I never thought I would be involved overseas. But eventually, when I went to seminary, I got much more connected to global Christianity, and I was very influenced by a professor named J. Christy Wilson, who's now passed away, but he was very influential in my life. My wife and I met in his class, and he really gave us kind of the burden for unreached people groups and kind of the remaining task. And my wife's aunt had spent 33 years in India, so we were just kind of already connected to India a little bit that way. So at some point in the early 80s, I met an Indian colleague, later colleague, who we prayed together, and he felt compelled to ask me to join him to help him to start a ministry in India, in which I eventually did that. And so anyway, the Lord kind of brought us into it. I went through the back door, but I was mostly been involved in training indigenous leaders in India, but other parts of the world too, eventually. But my main area has been in theology education. And eventually I got a master's in Islam from Princeton, and I did my doctoral work in Hinduism. So I've been really very interested in how Christianity in particular responds to the challenge of other religions. That's been a main thing, and just kind of how theology works cross-culturally. That doesn't come out quite so much in this particular book that you have, but that's been a big part of what I've been doing. And I think in terms of the textbook you have, I always felt like that mission work had become overly pragmatic and overly focused on kind of like praxis of ministry rather than really thinking through the foundations of it. And so I wanted to really write out a kind of trinitarian vision for mission. So that's what this book is. But my wife and I have been married for 43 years, and we have 2 children. We have an oldest is 40, named Jonathan, who's a CPA. And our daughter, Bethany, 38, is a missionary to an unreachable group in Tanzania. So she has spent 16 years really working very hard among a very challenging group, a total Muslim group in Tanzania. And she's now translated half the New Testament into a language called Alaguisa. So we're very proud of her. She lives in a very remote part of Africa with no running water, no electricity, no access to normal, just to grow all of her own food. It's a tough assignment, but she does it joyfully, and we get to go visit her every so often. but we're very thankful that God's given us a wonderful family. So that's a little bit about me, my background.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, as we shared before I hit record, my introduction to you was a assigned reading for a missiology class I was taking. Your book, Theology in the Context of World Christianity, if I remember the title correctly, and it really intersected quite well and powerfully with where I was at the time, living in Tibet and wrestling with how Tibetan Christians viewed the Bible and viewed the Christian faith, as well as
Mm.
the Tibetan Buddhist worldview, and just it gave me a lot of analytical and cognitive tools with which to understand what I was seeing and experiencing. And yeah, I've never forgotten that book. I wish we had some reading budget in this class to assign that text also, but it's on the recommended for further study list right now
Thank
for
you.
them. So you taught every year, if I'm not mistaken, for 3 decades at the new Theological College there in India. And you already mentioned, working your doctoral work in Hinduism. How did that long immersion with the Indian believers, the church in India, in a Hindu Christian context, shape the way you think about world Christianity, think about the Bible, think about God, the Christian life? What formative influence did that have on you?
Yeah, it had a huge impact on me. I went over there initially to teach when we first opened the school, and I felt like there was such a disconnect between the training I'd received at Gordon Conwell, which was, I think, I got a great thought education. First one I had an MDiv, but I felt like there was so much about the Indian culture and the Hindu context and the questions my students were asking me where I felt really ill prepared. And I really kind of realized at some point that I just needed a lot more focused study on my context, because, the Bible ultimately is about, how do we bring something from text to context? And I feel like I was pretty well trained in the text, but I really didn't understand the context I was in. And I think it really helped me to kind of go back. And so I learned so much from my students over the years. I also was helpful because I was actually, because of visa dynamics, I had to go back and forth between, half my time in India, half my time in the US. And so I was able to teach some of the same classes in the US and in India, which helped me understand how people think differently and kind of how the context shapes material a lot. So it was great. So what I basically did was I would go over to India. I would spend a good bit of time. I mean, maybe, I don't know, several months. I'd be teaching at the seminary, at the Bible College. And so that was just basically teaching courses, the kind of normal thing you would see. But then I would pivot at the end of my time. I would go out into the field and I would meet in very remote areas with all of our church planting people that were doing church planting. And we would sit down with them. Hey, what are you learning? What are you trying to figure out? And that eventually led me to do a survey of like the top 15 questions that Hindus ask Christians when they actually walked into an actual village. And I found out that of those top, I went through hundreds of questions, and I determined the top 15 questions and realized that none of those 15 were actually addressed in our training program, which was a real eye opener. And I realized, wow, we were teaching them great stuff, but it wasn't actually helping them to address the questions Hindus actually had. So all of that played into my thinking about, wow, we have to really think differently about our context. And I always remember what I later learned in my doctoral program, where Andrew Walls once said, the greatest work of a missionary is to get inside somebody else's head.
Mm-hmm.
That is great advice. We never really understood the questions inside the Hindu mind. So anyway, that book was eventually published as a book in India. It's called Aapke Sawal Hamari Jawab, Your Questions, Our Answers. And that became really a great tool we use. But the basic bottom line is I feel like the Indians took me on a journey that was profoundly formational for me, spiritually and intellectually, that caused me to think about a lot of things differently. And it really launched me into how does the Bible get better communicated across cultural linguistic lines? What is the implications of this? So that's been part of my journey. So yeah, those years in India, and I still do it. I mean, you said three decades, but I'll be there this summer teaching again.
Mm.
So it's been kind of an ongoing part of my life in every place I've ever taught. I said, by the way, I will be in India this summer. So that's worked out well for me. So I continue to go back to India teaching every year.
Yeah, I resonate with that experience. I didn't wasn't able to spend as many years as you have uh, in Asia, but I resonate with the experience. And I don't know if it was in your theology and context of world Christianity was the genesis of this idea, or somewhere else along the way. But a kind of dominating metaphor for me has about the scriptures themselves, and which reveal who God is this idea of this gigantic diamond, this multifaceted, and our perspective on it is shaped by our own experience, and we're coming
Mhm.
to it from a culturally, socially, as well as personal experience. And you can see some things about God that are right there and are immediate and obvious and make sense. But then there's some other things on the other side of the diamond that, are true of God and they're true in the Bible that maybe are obscured from my vision unless I kind of come around from another cultural vantage point. And one of the biggest blessings to me in living in Asia was learning to think from a different, cultural worldview perspective, illuminated some things on the text of scripture that were actually there all along that I just didn't see because I had some cultural
Absolutely.
blinders on.
So true. So
Um,
true.
so let's talk for a minute about the particular textbook we're working through and this idea of a Trinitarian understanding of the missionary task. You say in the intro that you wrote the book to fill a gap, really, of a view of missions that's grounded in a Trinitarian theology. What do you mean when you say that mission is fundamentally Trinitarian?
Well, just on the first point, actually, I just want to clarify that I do feel like that part of the missionary enterprise is mostly been driven by pragmatic kind of concerns. And so I found what happened was the way we talked about missions was based on like, well, what's effective, what's not effective, what's working, what's not working, which of course has a place for that. But I do think that in some ways it kind of missed. And so what you eventually had was that missions was talked about in terms of certain proof texts, like, okay, the Great Commission or whatever, with certain passages which, kind of like vivify missionary activity. And so missions becomes reduced to tasks which the church does, or even obedience to Christ, kind of an act of obedience, which is also true. But I felt like there was something deeper that was being missed there, which was actually that God Himself is a missionary God. That by being united with Christ, we are united to His mission, and ultimately, it's not simply task which the church is doing in the world, but ultimately what God is doing in the world.
Mm.
And because God's doing the world, He does invite us into that. And that's why I distinguish in the book between mission and missions. And I call mission is like that's God's mission in the world. God's out to redeem the world. And He calls us into various activities to support that. But I feel like without the real vision of mission, which is I find my Trinitarian and rooted in the nature of God, we would miss, I think, the proper theological foundation, which goes beyond just a few proof texts from like Psalm 67 or Psalm 2:8 or or the Great Commission or whatever, and really moving to more of a looking at the whole of Scripture is ultimately missiological.
Hmm. So if I can, say it back in just a sentence, it's more like instead of a view that missions is a task given delegated to the church, it's actually something that is rooted in the very being of God. He, in His own person, is about something, is doing something, accomplishing something,
Exactly.
and since the fall, it's been a redemptive mission that will one day He will bring to fruition. Another thing you mentioned right in the first section of your book, you talk about mega trends and you kind of give a
Mm.
bird's eye view of these major trends from the collapse of Western Christendom and the shift of Christianity's center of gravity to the global South and East. You wrote that book 15 years ago. Which of those mega trends do you feel like have accelerated? And then has anything surprised you since then, either in maybe they've dropped off or the speed in which they've accelerated or new trends have emerged? If, in other words, if you were to write that chapter over again, would there be some new things in there?
Definitely. I think the trend that I feel like is, I mean, I think most of the trends I mentioned in the book have been talked a lot about in the last 10 years, which I think is really encouraging, 15 years. Um, I think the one that I think most needs to be highlighted afresh is the one, I'm not sure what number it was, but the one that's entitled, the fourth branch of Christianity, where I still feel like that there's not been a sufficient appreciation for what is actually happening globally in terms of churches that are not aligned with Protestantism or Roman Catholicism, Orthodoxy, but are a lot of the new indigenous movements. Maybe it's because that's what I work with in India, but I think it's just true around the world. I've traveled a lot around the world and looked at revitalization movements. I've been on every continent. I spent a lot of time studying, what are the church movements that are growing and really changing the face of Christianity. And it's really mostly these indigenous movements. And so I think that's been largely still not fully appreciated, both on two sides. One, in terms of like what's happening just demographically, geographically, numerically, but also I think in terms of theologically, what they're saying. I mean, if you look at what the Chinese church, for example, what's being produced by the Chinese church, and some of the remarkable insights that are happening by Chinese pastors in a very persecuted situation, and their understanding of eschatology, for example, and what they're writing, and Africans on Christology, it's some really rich stuff. And I still find that the Western Academy does not read Chinese theologians. They're not reading from the House Church of China. They're not reading a lot of these amazing African writers. So that's one thing. But in terms of like, if I could write it again today, I think the one of the areas I missed or didn't fully anticipate was the rising tide of persecution globally. I think that's been a really, I do dedicate a chapter to persecution in the book. I'm very thankful for that. And so I'm thankful that I did talk about persecution in that textbook. I've forgotten what chapter it was, but in the mega trends, I don't really mention as a rising trend, but it's turned out to be, and as you probably know, if you went to Lausanne in Korea this a year and a half ago, that was one of the big nights focused on that. And I thought, you know what, it's something I really wish I had talked more about in terms of mega trends, was the rise of persecution, because the church is experiencing unprecedented persecution today, whether it be in Nigeria or India, China. I mean, it's around the world. If you follow some of the sites that track it, it's unprecedented.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that day at Lausanne 4 was a very
Yeah.
powerful day and sobering day for everyone that was there. Um, at the end of that opening section, you wrote something that I wouldn't have expected to be there, but you called for a selah, a pause, an interlude, a time to pause and rethink. Speaking mainly to Christians in the West, in light of these trends, in light of these global realities and complexities, we need a time of pause, a time out, if you will.
Yeah.
Would you say to rethink how we're doing this? Would you say that a mission salah has occurred, or are we still just cranking on business as usual?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that in some ways there has been some Selah, and there's times where we still need it. I mean, I think that on the first one, I think there's been clearly a much more powerful global awareness that mission enterprise is now a global enterprise, and you have, Africans and Indians and Chinese crossing cultural boundaries of the gospel in profound ways. And we're clearly beyond, the West reaches the rest kind of paradigm. And so I think in terms of that kind of pause, I do think that it's there. I do think that it's not complete, and there's two reasons for it. Number one, I still think that North American young people, and this may be applied to your class, I think they still are in the place of thinking that the global Christianity is about other places, other continents, what God's doing in Africa and India, et cetera. And they don't realize that North America is part of global Christianity. And so therefore, what happens in North America is still extremely important globally, and everybody in the world acknowledges that. And so we have to realize, I think going back to the original 1974 design, it takes the whole church to bring the whole gospel to the whole world. And I think that it's not the time for North Americans to interpret selah as being, we're now no longer involved in this. We're out of it. It's like it's the Africans are now taking it, and we have become passive. I think we understand that the pause is really about becoming more collaborators globally, but we still need to be deeply involved. And there's gifts that North Americans bring, which are unique to North America, and we should not lose those gifts. And from the church, I view it like a banquet. Everyone's bringing their covered dish dinner to a banquet. Like Alabama's famous for covered dish dinners, right? And we need our dish, and I bring our dish. So that's important. I think the other part of the Selah that really hit me was back to Lausanne, because if you remember on the last day of the conference, there was a big address given by a well-known Christian leader in North America, and he gave like 10 reasons why we're gonna if we do these 10 things, we'll finish the task. And I wrote a blog after that because I made the comment. I said, all 10 of those things were great things, but what he didn't realize is that even if the church implemented all 10 of those things he called us to, this is the closing day of Lausanne now, don't forget, it would not fundamentally change the needle whatsoever on the remaining task. And yet the title of the talk was how to complete the task, the remaining task. There was still a gap between realizing the distinction between, like, however good our evangelism and discipleship may be, which of course is important, with what's required to cross cultural boundaries, learn languages, and actually complete the remaining task. That goes back to Ralph Winter. I really do think that there's still Christians who don't understand that we can't. They say we're going to give Jesus a birthday present in 2030, right? The 2000th anniversary of his ministry, of all the people unreached. It's not going to happen. It can't happen because there's simply not enough time for people to go cross boundaries and learn the languages necessary to bring the gospel. And so there's this kind of disconnect between American, what I call managerial missions, where we're going to put it on a chart and I'll do it, and what's actually involved in the task. So in that sense, I think we still need to step back and be more sober-minded about what is actually involved in reaching the remaining 7,326 people groups that don't have the gospel. And it's going to take decades to do that. I don't care what anybody says, it'll take decades. We are not going to finish this in my lifetime. And I think that's a sobering thing. And that's why I still say we do still need a little bit of a selah to realize what's involved.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. One thing that I found myself saying a lot these days is, but it comes across as so out of left field for most of the particularly young aspiring missionary type folks that I encounter, is that actually going slower, especially in the beginning, is in the long run going much faster. But if you rush into missions and then if you try to rush the missionary process, in the end, you will at best go much slower because you don't have the linguistic, cultural, worldview framework to be able to make the gospel clear and compelling to folks. But at worst, you're communicating things that are sub-biblical and without knowing it. And so going
that's
slower.
particularly true with AI. I think with AI, there's this idea that somehow AI is going to put all the Bible in every language, but there's no logarithms to work with my daughter's language, Alaguisa. There's no way to get out of the fact that somebody has to learn that language.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that AI can't help us and assist us, but at the end of the day, what we found is if you use AI to a point where you get a bad translation, it actually misses. It's so bad that you can't actually, it's hard to get back on it. Better just start from scratch. But the bigger point to me about AI kind of stuff is that if you look at the history of Bible translation, people forget it's not about producing a Bible. That's part of it. The purpose is to produce a church. And so the people who do Bible translation that's the people who come to Christ. That's the people you're discipling. And so there's such an American mentality of how we're going to use all kinds of tools to do things quickly. But I agree with you. There's nothing quick about the Great Commission. It takes time, takes commitment, it takes lifetimes of work, and there's no way you can just do this by clicking a mouse. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, we're kind of a technocrat sort of approach to missions, unfortunately. But what your daughter is a prime example. This is the only way to do it, really. Um, Another thing that you bring out in the book is, alongside arguing a trinitarian understanding of mission, one of your distinctive notes is arguing for an eschatological understanding of missions, namely that it's not just about saving souls, and going to heaven when we die, but God's mission is one of cosmic renewal. You're not the first person to say this, and as a matter of fact, you can go back to, you know, Latin American theologians, missiologists like Padilla and Escobar were arguing this long before it became popular by more North American theologians. But why is it so important that we have this understanding of mission, that God is about restoring all things under the lordship of Christ, not just the human person or just the soul within the human person?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that if you look at the way eschatology is unfolding in the Western world, eschatology tends to be focused on the 6 things that are going to happen at the end time before Christ comes back, and charts and graphs and all of that. When ultimately we have to see that the church is itself an eschatological people, the rule and reign of God is already breaking into the present evil age, and we are being transformed into his likeness now. And so that involves, of course, the whole of creation, because the new creation ultimately is about the redemption of all things. So I do think that in some ways missions has been hurt by an overly individualistic, an overly transactional view of what it means to come to Christ, rather than a fully transformational view of culture and people and everything imaginable. So in that sense, yeah, you're right. I think that's part of what made Lausanne, the 74 Lausanne, so powerful, because it was actually, you mentioned Rene Padilla. If you know the history of the Lausanne Covenant, I think it's, I recall Article 19, but whatever it is, it's that article about social engagement in the Lausanne Covenant that was not in the original draft that David Wells and John Stott had penned out. Nothing against them, but it just wasn't really in the forefront of their mind. And he stood on the floor of the Congress and said, this is unacceptable. We have to have the gospel must be transformative at the structural level, not just personal redemption of people's individual souls, the point you made. And so people to this day look back on that, the history of that, and say, it was that article which made the Lausanne Covenant kind of an article, almost like a statement of faith for the ages. I mean, it has been used by churches all over the world as a kind of it's been like the most globally used statement of faith for churches around the world. And it was because of that vision that was put by Rene Padilla to say that we have to believe that involves, how we think about the poor. And of course, the new generation, they're very, very well aware of this. I mean, I think that's been one of the great things about the younger generation. They do make those connections better than we did, which we tend to separate things out a lot more. So it's been refreshing, it's been encouraging, and I do think that I was just simply extending something that you're right, that had been started by others, and the way they talk about the power of the gospel.
Yeah. Um, you also talk about really a major section of the book is calling for a robust theology of religion, that when we go to these places where folks have been, steeped for generations, even hundreds of years, millennia, even in, major world religions, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and others. How would you articulate why is it so important that we have a theology of religion, and so that we can then engage religion in a way that is faithful to the gospel?
Yeah, a great question. I mean, I think the most obvious answer is if you look at the 7,230 some odd people groups without the gospel, the vast majority of them already belong to a world religion. They're Hindus, they're Buddhists, they're Muslims. And so therefore, we can't pretend that this is not a part of why people are resistant. I tell my classes that the groups are unreached for a reason. They're resistant for a reason. It's not just simply we haven't gotten there yet. A lot of these are people groups that have been in close proximity to the gospel for, I mean, India's had, Christianity there since the first century. So the question is why? Why hasn't Christianity just kind of spread across India? Well, it's because of certain resistant issues that are really endemic to the nature of Hinduism or Islam and Buddhism, et cetera. So on the first hand, I think it's just important to know your context, and your context is both cultural and religious. But secondly, I think it's important to recognize that religions are both simultaneously signs of despair and hope. They're signs of, resistance and also God's grace. So what you find when you look at religions, and unfortunately people tend to go to one or the other, but you tend to find, number one, great examples of utter lostness, where the religions are clearly moving the wrong direction or trying to conceptualize things in ways that are just so far out of balance with biblical Christianity. But you also find expressions of longing that are there, that are like, we call this general revelation, things where God has revealed himself generally, and people are longing for that. And I think even the things like with Hinduism, things is like, as crazy as a monistic worldview, which tries to, your Atman is Brahman, all of that. You look at down the bottom line, it's a longing to be in union with God.
Yeah.
Well, that's what Christianity is. It's about the fulfillment of that longing through Jesus Christ. So I found that religions, even Islam, with all of its challenges, Islam does present longings that ultimately fulfilled in Christ. So I think in some ways the early church had a divide over this point in the second century. If you look at Tertullian, he's the one that said, what does Athens do with Jerusalem? More confrontational. But other voices like Justin Martyr were much more like, no, actually, the gospel doesn't just say no to religions, it fulfills them. It also fulfills longings that are present. And we need to think about both sides of this equation. And so I've been much more on that side of things. I believe there's no hope apart from Jesus Christ. I believe the only hope for salvation is in Christ. I believe in the absolute authority of Scripture. But I do believe that, as Paul says, God has not left himself without a witness. And therefore, I believe that we need to be attentive to the ways in which God has revealed himself, and as even pointers to lead people to a deeper questions that only the gospel can answer.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you brought out the contrast between Tertullian and Justin Martyr, and then downstream from Augustine and how he engaged with the Greek philosophy prominent in his day. We're having students read from J.H. Bavinck, who has a pretty robust theology of religion. He tries to answer how does the Christian explain why these religions are even there in the first place? And he's arguing from his uncle Herman Bavinck's view of like God's revelation is present and prevalent and immediate all the time to everyone, and they suppress it, and then they twist it, and this simple human heart moves it towards idolatrous ends and goals. But nevertheless, God has not left himself without a witness. We can bank on that, and it's producing these longings that actually they do long for God, but yet avoid God. They push him away at the same time, and yeah. So they'll be
Even John
engaging
Calvin taught that. Even John Calvin taught that. I mean, that's what's so beautiful about it. This is not just a Wesleyan view. This goes to Reformed theology as well. That God, as Calvin put it, God basically leaves trace himself, which he enlarges in people that have otherwise rejected him, and use that to draw him to himself.
Yeah, we also have them reading from Newbegin, who spent his major life work in southern India, but who was believed along these lines as well. Going back to something you said earlier about a pragmatic way of and mode of going about pragmatic managerial way of going about missions, what would it look like for the church, a church or the church in America to do differently? What would a non-pragmatic Could you flesh out for us a little bit, or perhaps point to an example that exemplifies a more robust Trinitarian way of going about missions that seriously takes into account context and the social, cultural, religious context into which they're ministering? Can you, what would that look like, or can you give us some examples?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's an interesting dichotomy on this point. I do think that if you actually were to talk to typical mission boards out there and then what they do, and you would actually sit down with their directors, um, you would say that most of them would actually express what we're saying in this class. They would say, ultimately, this is something that this is the Lord's mission, and He's called us into that, and we can't make it happen. Okay, but on the other hand, I do think there's a donor side to the whole thing. When you get into churches who are either supporting or not supporting people in missions, and should they do this program or not, or even down to someone's personal support they're raising, I do think that especially in the West, we look for data points. How many people have you preached to? How many people have you come to Christ? And you end up with kind of almost a statistical kind of way of talking about our ministry. You're not going to come back and say, as our daughter does many times, she'll tell her people, this term, in terms of things that you normally count, nothing has happened. If you're looking for, in her case, I know one time she said it was really precious because she'd been there for quite a few years, and she said, someone said to her, well, how's it going? How many people led to Christ? She said, well, to be honest with you, I've led 6 people to Christ in the last term, and 6 have been baptized, but 3 of them have returned back to Islam. So I'm a net of 3. Okay. In any kind of normal way, that looks like a failure. But having been there myself a number of times, what I realized is that it used to be no one had any idea what the gospel was. Now, wherever you go, people know the gospel. They're listening to these audio devices. And there's definitely seeds being sown that are very profoundly present, and God is doing His work, but it's hard to report on it, and the kind of things we do. So I think it's kind of thing where I don't really see it so much as, these boards doing a great job, these are not doing a good job. I think actually what you find is a kind of a tortuous mixture of these two things, where on the one hand, you don't want to fall on the one side where you say, well, this is God's work and we're passive. Like, well, if this is God's work, what are we doing there? The point is God has called us to participate with Him in the work. On the other hand, we can't simply report out and say that it always meets kind of like managerial kind of numbers, and we've baptized this many. And it's actually can be discouraging to missionaries when they read these reports that say, we often that one of the jokes among missionaries, I think you know this, is they'll say, well, the people who write missionary biographies, they wrote them in their 30th year when the breakthrough happened.
Right.
And so when you read the book, oh my goodness, they went there at Papua New Guinea and this amazing happened. And they don't tell you about the 29 years where nothing happened.
Right.
And so it's kind of like there's a lot of missionaries will say, I wish I had the book on the first 29 years, because that's the part that's where they live, is in that 29 years before the breakthrough happens. And a lot of them die without it happening. The person comes in right after them and has a great harvest, and it's back to Paul. Some sow, some are watering, but it's God's harvest. I don't think we're really there and really appreciating that yet. And people are always trying to come up with stories that are impressive, but sometimes it's just discouraging and nothing's happening.
Right. Yeah, I just I can't believe I hadn't read it until recently, but just recently finished To the Golden Shore on Adoniram Judson, and I'm crying throughout the
Classic.
book.
I
It's
know.
like,
Classic.
oh my gosh! And now
I
that's
know.
going to be required reading for any missionary who comes to this seminary who wants to go.
I read that
It's amazing.
book in 1981, and it was life-changing. I mean, it was just, as you say, hanging upside down in a Burmese prison, and it was required for our classes. And I love the fact that we grew up at a time when there was a real robust place for the missionary biography. My shelf is full of them here, but they're not as popular today. But it's, to me, there's nothing like it. Nothing like it.
Yeah. I've read many others, but that one I just hadn't gotten around to reading, and I'm ashamed to say that. Like, and it was just so wonderful and encouraging and challenging and just heart wrenching, all thrown into one. Um, so let me ask this, and then just maybe one more question after this. But um, help us think through, like, if you were to craft a training process for Americans aspiring to be missionaries to engage in a very, in what I view as a very complex world, and in some ways, because of what Christianity is truly globalized in a major. I mean, it's always a global faith, but you know what I mean in terms of the demographic shifts we've witnessed over the last 50 years. But um, because you're not just dealing with the Christian faith and this people group and their religious background. You're also dealing with, well, there's probably a little church among them, maybe, or adjacent to, and and their theology maybe is a little different, has a different sort of history and pedigree to it than yours, and you're having to navigate relationship with other indigenous church leaders and their biblical ecclesial background. You're having to navigate everywhere you go. There's another missionary somewhere there, not, nearby, at least, maybe not focused on the same people group, but you're dealing with other mission agencies who have a different, perhaps, philosophy and of ministry. You're having to navigate that tension. There's multiple tensions, persecution, government regulation. I mean, it's a complex world. I mean, it's always been the case, but I think there are unique complexities of missions in the 21st century that, in my view, call for really astute missionaries that can operate and navigate multiple tensions all at the same time. That's my view. I feel like you probably share that to some degree. If you were to chart a course for, here's what, if I could be in charge of a missionary training process, what would be some key elements in that process before you felt comfortable sending them out?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, we talk about, mission to the world, mission to the church, mission to mission. I do think that there is a process which you outlined where, like, William Carey is going from, England to the world. And that's a very different process than later on when you actually have an indigenous church there and your mission now is working with not only unreached people groups, but potentially church there. And eventually these churches start their own mission agencies, their own board. That's happening. So then you have mission to mission. So that process is a real one. And so I think that, first of all, I would say that it's really important to recognize the limitations of a training program that's divorced from a field experience, whether it be kind of like immersion kind of exploration or your first term as a missionary. I do think that when you're in a program like I'm teaching in now, there's obviously really important to get people good readings, good classroom conversations, have people come in that can talk to them, and do the kind of preparations, reading these people like you mentioned, Leslie Newbigin, people like that, and Andrew Walls, Lamin Sane. These are great people that can really help us think about, world Christianity, Philip Jenkins, whoever. But that's very different from like what happens when you hit the ground. And there's things you cannot learn in the classroom. You can only learn when you're in the context. So to me, the challenge is actually creating, good relationships between the training process and the board. So for example, when I was at Gordon Conwell, we developed connections with agencies where we would provide them with missionary recruits, and we would, our training programs work seamlessly with their orientation and training program. And we did that a little less at Asbury, but we did do it there to some degree. But that, to me, here they have what's called a CCPM, a cross-cultural practical ministry, where they have to go for 6 weeks overseas, and it's a good requirement where they go and they actually get to meet with missionaries, know what it's like. But you can't ever train somebody in a context where when they graduate, you're good to go. It's not that way. You have to see yourself as an apprentice kind of person, and you're going there first to do cultural learning and language learning, and that can't be done, perfectly and like stateside. So you have to view it as a lifelong learning process and working in good collaboration with the mission boards. And the problem that many church schools have is that if they're like in a particular denominational school, let's say you're like PCA and you work with Mission to the World, or you're at Southern Baptist and you're working with the IME, that's not easy because you're one, training program and your people are coming through. And I don't know what it's like for you, but in your class, but those are much simpler relationships because you have a church that's connected to a training program. But in the larger world, it doesn't work that way. A lot of the mission agencies are independent, and they work with places like Beeson, which are interdenominational. Gordon Cunnell's that way too. And so we work with over a dozen different boards, and they have different requirements, different ideas about what training is required. Especially we're going to Wycliffe, which involves a lot more linguistic work. We have to work with SIL and the training program in Texas. There was just a lot of things that just were different based on the agency. But I do think the relationship between a training program and the church and the agency is really important to have that relationship, strong and healthy, and not just view training as something that happens independently of the field or the church.
Yeah, so integrated the local church, the training, and the field. One of the troubling things that I find is when people, and I had an aha moment not too long ago, where a missionary mobilizer and I were talking, and this person knew my backstory and passion for missions and the unreached, et cetera, and thought it was so weird now that I'm in a seminary context and like a complete, right angle turn. And we were struggling to understand each other, and I was explaining, well, this is kind of what we're doing. It's actually in line with my whole trajectory of my life here. And then she made the comment, oh, you're trying to uh reconfigure what seminary is, because I thought seminary is for pastors, therefore missionaries don't need that. So I find a lot of young folks forego any kind of in-depth or at least formal biblical theological training because, well, that's what pastors do, and that's not really for missionaries. And so
Mm.
the alternative route is some version of an abbreviated, uh, more technique, more methods, more uh, cross-cultural skills oriented type, orientation type training. And I find that even a lot of agencies today are quite okay with that. And maybe they might require a few hours of seminary education, but in terms of a robust sort of biblical, theological, missiological formation that might take a few years to complete, that is almost nowhere in their,
Mm.
realm of possible routes to take, a lot of folks that I find.
Yeah, that's a great word.
So, and wrapping this up, if you were to write a concluding chapter now, 15 years on, to that book, in light of, the different developments that you've noticed since then, what note would you end on? What word of hope or warning or challenge or exhortation would you want to leave the global church and perhaps more specifically the church in North America?
Well, it definitely end on a note of optimism because the gospel is inherently optimistic, and we have this kind of extravagant view of God's grace, that God loves the peoples of the world, and He wants to see them drawn to Himself. So I'm encouraged by the robust nature of what's happening globally. There's a lot of great things happening. I'll be in the Philippines in a few days at the Go conference. It's part of every nation, and they work in 82 nations. This is like all Asian missionaries that no one's ever heard of here, but there's like thousands of people that I'll be speaking to, and they have their seminary, their every nation seminary, where they're graduating all these people this way. I'll be speaking the graduation. I could go on and on and on. There's just so much happening in India, in the Philippines, and South Africa, and around the world. So these are, to me, real signs of hope that God is on the move. God is working, and it's not something that we should be at all feel like that there's some kind of this is all falling apart. I just think that we have to obviously learn what it means to to recognize the signs of the times and what's happening and the challenges that we're facing in North America. These are not good days for the church in North America. But, this is the time when we can learn from the global church, and we can hopefully regain our footing here.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Are you working on any, what's the next project, writing project or intellectual project you're working on that we could be looking forward to?
Yeah, I'm actually working on a textbook for world religions that goes through all of world religions, but it's a textbook that's a bit unusual because on the one hand, it's a very serious textbook that kind of lays out, the key teachings of every religion, but it has a chapter that gives a Christian theological response and how to think about it theologically. So I'm excited about it. As I'm about maybe 30,000 words into it, I got about another over 100,000, 150,000 to go. So I got a long way to go, but I'm making progress on it.
Okay. Any publication date goal for you?
It'll be probably 2 years from now.
Okay.
So unfortunately, it won't be overnight. It's like a lot of things takes time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing that when it comes out.
I do have an article coming out soon on general revelation that I've been working on. I'm just in the last few moments finishing it, another hour or two finishing it. But it's basically looking at the history of how the church has understood general revelation through time. It's been accepted by World Christianity Journal. And so we're just kind of an editing process right now. But I do think it's really interesting to go back in time and see how Christians throughout the ages have understood general revelation and God's working, outside of his church in one ways to draw people to himself and how the church connects with that. So anyway, I'm doing a little work on that.
Good. Well, I'll look forward to reading that when it comes out. Well,
Thanks a lot. And may the Lord bless your seminary, Christ our Redeemer. May God bless in every way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, let me close our time in prayer and then I'll let you go.